All right, so yesterday we went over Chapter 17, which was on functions and modules and a lot of other good stuff. And today we're going to go over Chapter 18. I'm going to go over this kind of quickly. The example that's in the chapter is fairly complex, so I've given you a much simpler example, and that's the code that you have in front of you. Tomorrow we'll go over Chapter 18. Friday will be lab the entire period. What I've decided I'm going to do, and I am going to tape this, is on Monday of next week. Now this won't affect you two, but on Monday of next week we're going to download the software that you're going to use next semester. All right? And like I said, I'm going to tape it, and I am going to go over it all over again when we start in spring, because there's going to be, right now there's 8 people in that class. So there'll be 5 people who aren't going to be here for it, but I'm going to make sure I put that out there. I'm going to ask them to try to do it themselves. And then on Tuesday I'm going to do the same thing with you guys with Android Studio and what we're going to be using in that class for spring. All right, so we're on Chapter 18. I'm on page 609, How to Work with Ajax. Ajax it's a very interesting phenomenon, and what I mean is it allows you to do partial page refreshes. Now, I'm going to show you something that's going to make no sense, and you'll be like, why are you showing us this? Because I want to show you. I used to love going out to familyvideo.com, not because I go to Family Video, but the way it used to be set up on here on their homepage is they'd have a listing of all their current movies, all the newer movies, all right? And they still have some of that stuff. So here's new releases, all right? And what used to happen was when you put your mouse here, a little bubble would come up with like a little thing explaining what the movie was about. And if you put your mouse there, it would come in, and then when you'd leave, it would go away. That's Ajax in action, because part of the screen was refreshing. Now, it still is doing it. When you look at this, you know, you're getting the little effect here, but it's not really what it used to be. All right, and I mean, I've talked to you about things like Google Suggest, etc., and we've looked at those. There's plenty of things that are like this. Google Maps is another one too. As you're zooming in and out, it's not redrawing everything. All right? So, again, the idea behind that is it's Ajax. Ajax is an acronym, but most people will tell you today that the acronym doesn't make much sense anymore. Let me explain why. It stands for Asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. All right? The reason it's not used that much anymore and it's not explained that way is much of the stuff that's done today, you can use XML, and it's still used quite a bit. These guys are going to use XML a lot next semester with the Android stuff. You just do. All right? Because for every time you create a project, it creates both a .java file and a .xml file. All right? So we'll talk about that kind of stuff later. But the point is, most of the stuff done with Ajax today, the majority, I would say, is done with JSON, JavaScript object notation, as opposed to using XML. That's why a lot of people will tell you Ajax is not an acronym anymore. It's not a big thing, but just so you hear that. So as it says, this chapter shows how to use Ajax to update a web page without loading a new page into the browser. Sometimes it's referred to as an update in place. You may have noticed this already if you've gone out to sites that don't incorporate Ajax, that if you do something, if you click a button or you do whatever, that basically the page redraws itself, and you get white for just maybe just for a second, and it's called flicker. But the idea behind that is Ajax is supposed to remove flicker because it only redraws the part of the screen that needs to be redrawn. All right. So it says this chapter also shows how to use 2 web services that provide the data that you can use for development and testing. Now, the examples that are in the chapter work. There is absolutely nothing wrong with them. The examples that I gave you, one of them has about 25 lines of code in it, and the other one has about 20. Well, the one that they give in here, the better one, the astronomy picture of the day, has closer to 100. All right, so I tried to cut it down and give you something that I thought was much more simplistic for us to look at. And we will look at those in just a couple minutes. All right, so the examples that I've given you, just like the ones they'll talk about in the chapter, I've given you the same example and it's done using both an XML HTTP request, and usually you never see it referenced like this. It's usually called an XHR. You know, X from XML, H for HTTP, and R for request. All right? And then there's also a fetch API. And what a fetch API usually is used for is you can go out to the internet, grab information, and bring it into the program. All right, so for example, if I was going to write some kind of a program that you could, you know, let's just say it had a very simple interface in it. It had a drop-down list, or maybe even simpler than that, a text box and a button. It doesn't get much simpler than that. So I could, for example, I could go and I could type in Wentzville, Mo into the text box. I could hit the button, it would go out to a weather API, and it would find out the current weather conditions. And you know, if I set it all up, I could bring in icons. It looks, I don't know if it's still raining. It was a little bit this morning. So it could show like a little rain coming down, and let's say it looks like it's 47. So it could say 47 degrees and cloudy, etc., that kind of a thing. All right. Now you can do some of that with XML HTTP request, but that's not really what it's as much as what it's used for. All right. So fetch is something that you can use, and it's used both on the client side and it's used on the server side. I've had students this semester, we've used fetch for some of our projects. Now, we don't typically use fetch. We use a product that's called Axios because it's a little bit more streamlined. It works a little bit better. That's all I want to say about that. All right, with this astronomy picture of the day application, what you're able to do is you're able to go in and put in a date in a text box, click a button, and it shows you an image for that day. That's what it does. All right. And then it says how to make multiple Ajax requests. Well, notice in here it says the XML HTTP request object and callback hell. And you know, with callback hell, there literally is, if you want to go out to it, it's one page, it's not very much, but there's a callbackhell.com website. But the idea is kind of look at it that you've got an if statement. And inside of there, in order for that to work, you've got another if statement. In order for that to work, you've got another if statement. Pretty soon you're embedded so deep that it's kind of hard to figure out where the hell you started. And that's sort of the same kind of thing that happens with this callback hell. All right? So we'll talk about that. This photo viewer application, I don't really like this application that they put in there, so I'm not going to say much about it. Now notice the more skills for working with promises. We have talked in here a little bit before about promises. All right? Just to take you quickly on the ride here, all right, that what happened was basically when promises are kind of a newer type of thing that's come up to make things better, for lack of better words. All right? And that's one thing about programmers, no matter how simple you make stuff for them, they want it simpler. All right? So in many ways, and they won't talk about it, I don't think it's talked about in here much, but if at all, but promises are kind of being, they're still out there. There's millions of lines of code with promises in them. But today you use a lot more than promises. You use what's called async and await. All right. So, and then the chapter ends by talking about what's typically referred to as CORS, cross-origin requests. So we'll talk about what that is. All right. And like I said, I want to go through this fairly quickly so I can go through the code examples that I gave you. All right. So it says the chapter begins by describing how Ajax works. Then it describes the two data formats that are used. I've kind of mentioned this stuff in here to you already. All right. It does say in here, often applications or script are part of a web service that provides an API. That's an application program interface. We've talked about that a little bit. That's what the majority of the class that the AWD 1111 class is. We start by doing something fairly simplistic, and maybe I even showed you this. I don't remember. I'd have to go dig it out. But we went out to the New York Stock Exchange. You could put in some kind of a stock, like you could put in BUD, all right, which is the symbol name for Anheuser-Busch. And it would go out to Amex, and it would figure out, you know, whatever, and it would come back and show us whatever information we wanted about stocks, as an example. All right, there's more to it than that. What we're doing in there and what we've gotten into is we're actually developing full MERN stack applications. What's MERN? It's an acronym, MongoDB, so we're using a database, Express, which we'll talk about tomorrow, React, which is what we use for our front end, and Node.js, which we'll also talk about tomorrow. All right, so what they show in here is this is kind of how stuff normally works. All right, forget the Ajax part for a second, but you come in your browser, let's just say you type in rankin.edu, just that. You hit enter. You are making an HTTP request. That is going out to some web server out there someplace, all right? That's either it's at or inside of Rankin St. Louis, or at some place where they're renting it or whatever, all right? And it'll figure out whether or not it has the information right there where it can give it back to you, or whether it has to go and ask something else, all right? I mean, if it's very simple stuff, it might be able to, boom, give it back to you right away. If it's a little bit more than that, if you're asking for information about classes or whatever, it might take a couple seconds because you can see what's happening here. Typically, this whole thing is referred to as a round trip, all right? So you're sending out a request, you're getting back a response. But notice, the response is a new page. On the other hand, when you look at how it's processed with Ajax, it looks the same, but you're only getting the changed data back. That's why it only has to do a partial refresh or a partial redraw, whatever it is you want to call it. Now, I'm not going to read to you, but that's pretty much what they're mentioning in here. All right? So the two common data formats I already mentioned. So when you look in here, this is what XML looks like. It's really not hard, all right, except for one thing. The idea is back in the late 90s, maybe it was the early 90s, I don't know. But people, and I've given you this little chronology before. People had decided that HTML was outdated. We don't need it anymore. All right? There's got to be a better way to do it. So they came up with XML. The biggest difference between HTML and XML is in XML you make your own tags. Well, that kind of was problematic because you could still use some HTML tags. So for instance, let's say I'm a carpenter and I want to talk about a table, like something wooden with 4 legs. And I use table. Does table mean that it's a table? Or does table mean that it's a table tag like we'd use for HTML? And there were all sorts of different dialects. There's math XML. There was chemical XML, music XML, etc. At one time, I know there were more than 200 of these. And a lot of them might still be around. I don't know. But if you look up here, first of all, it never really became as popular as people thought it would be because there's only been one version. Notice where it says version equal 1.0. That's the only version there's ever been. Even though this has been around, I'd say, for a good 20 plus years. All right? And the encoding just basically means that we're using Unicode character set here. But instead of HTML tags around everything, notice we've got the tags we made. Management. So those are our root tags right there. And management has what? A team member. And every team member has a name, has a title, and has a biography. All right, so it's pretty easy when you look at it that way to see how it's set up. Now, when you look at it on JSON, it's not exactly the same, but it looks more like the kind of stuff that we went over with JavaScript when we were talking about classes. One of the reasons that this has become more popular than using XML is it's more JavaScript-like. All right, people look at it, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so you've got this right here. This is the entire object, everything that's in there. All right, and you can see there's an array of these objects because we've got the bracket there and the bracket there. And then here's one object that's in the array, and here's another object that's in the array. So again, most people look at that it's much easier to reconcile and take a look and figure out what's going on with that. Not everybody agrees with that. All right? As it says, it's less verbose, so it uses less memory. All right? Now, this is kind of neat here, this Json Placeholder Api. What is it? Well, there's more than one of these. All right? Why am I telling you this? Because it's a place that you can go and get what's typically referred to as fake data. So if, in other words, if I am writing a program and I know that my program is going to have a bunch of users in it, I don't want to go and have to create all those myself. I can go and bring them in. So just to show you quickly, I don't want to spend much time on this, but what I'm talking about, I'm going to grab, I keep it from yesterday, let's see. No, I did not. Okay. So I'm going to put this in. Again, we don't really need the HTTPS, but I'll put it in there anyway. But I'm going to put in Json Placeholder .tp tippy code, whatever you want to call that, .com. Whoops. All right, so I'm going to put that in and hit enter. And that's kind of what it shows you. All right, it's what they just mentioned in the book. But I'm not going to run through all of them, but one of the ones they put in there was /users. And you hit enter. And what does it give you? 10 different users. All right, so this would be, for example, the kind of stuff, if you wanted to use it, that you could go and put into a database. And it really wouldn't be that hard. Now, this works really well with a database that's not as structured as the ones you guys learned last year, an SQL database, but the one that we'll work with in spring, which is a no SQL database, all right, like MongoDB. And again, that's what it looks like. I've got a, yours is probably going to look more like this, where mine looks like that. And what's the big difference? None. I just got a tool that I've put in here to make mine look a little bit nicer. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but I could go through all of these. All right? And notice it gives me 100 posts, 500 comments, 100 photo albums, etc. So you can go to any of these. All right? So again, this is an API. This is an application program interface. Every time you go out there and you put in something like /users or, again, /comments, and you hit enter, those are called endpoints, because it's a place that you can go to retrieve data from the application program interface, which is exactly what we're doing right there. All right. And again, you want to read some more on there, go ahead. So, how to make a single Ajax request. I want to spend a little bit of time on this because they're going to talk about how to do it with XHR, and they're going to talk about how to do it with fetch. All right? So, first, as it says, they're going to talk about this XML HTTP object that's typically abbreviated to XHR. As it says, every Ajax request uses open and send methods. Open opens the connection. Send is basically used to send the data. All right? And there's more to it than that. So let's take a look at an example. All right? So here they're mentioning, again, I'm not going to read any of this to you, but you can see if you want to know more about the open and the send, etc., and the kind of stuff that can happen. All right? Now, when you go to send it, there's checks that you want to make sure that everything is basically in place so that when you do the send, it goes through correctly. All right? For instance, notice in here there's something called a ready state. All right? So it says a numeric value that indicates the state of the current request. So if I've tried sending something out and it worked, the ready state is going to be equal to 4. If I try sending something out, but there's a big backlog on the network, it might be hung for a while. So it might be at 0, where it's unsent. If I'm sending it to someone, and so if I'm sending it out, like we just looked at to that fake thing I showed you, and if for some reason they're down, it might have been sent, but it might not be opened yet. Does all that make sense? So there's different ways, all right, that this can be handled. And then you want to look at the status. Notice it says the status code is returned in something in numeric format. Things that are typically in the 200 area are good. All right? things that are typically in the 400 area are not good. If there are 400 areas that get sent back in the status, the problem's on your end. If there are 500 numbers that get sent back, it's not on your end, it's on the server end. Typically, there's nothing you can do about that. If I'm trying to go out and hit a server that's out in another country and there's a problem with the server, there's not much I can do about that other than try it again later. All right? So when we look in here, notice what we have. So here we're creating the new request. And we're specifying that the response type is JSON. Again, rather than JSON, we could have specified that the response type, rather than JSON, was XML. All right? So it says here on ready state change, if it's equal to 4, and typically we'd use the triple equals here, but it works with 2 equals. But if it's 4, again, meaning it's done, and the status is 200, meaning success, we just log, and that's this right here. All right? And then we're saying if it's an error, just send the error message. All right? We're not sending a status. If there's an error, my guess is you've all done this at one time or another. You've gone out to a website to get something, and it comes back, and it either says 404 not found, or it just comes back and says, network down, please try again later. All right? That would be how you'd handle it there. All right. Then they're using a GET request. And well, again, what they're doing here is they are asking for users. And then they're sending it. So what's going to happen as it goes through in here is it goes through and it's going to do basically, it's going to go in and it's going to do these two things in here. It's going to do the open and it's going to do the send. Then it's going to come in here and check this stuff. And if everything works, that's what you're going to get. You've seen a little bit of that type of stuff already. And again, if you click here on the curly brace, it's going to expand it where you can see everything that gets returned. All right, so again, showing you all this stuff. The key takeaway is this second bullet here. It says to handle the events raised by the object, you can assign a callback. And again, the callback is, imagine that if we lived in a synchronous world, all right, in a synchronous world. So let's assume for a second, all right, and that you had to do this. This would make no sense, but you'll get what I'm talking about hopefully in a second. So I go into a restaurant, all right, and they say, what do you want? And I say, okay, what do you want to drink? All right, so let's just say I want a beer. So I tell them I want a beer, okay, and what do you want for your meal? I want a steak, I want a baked potato, and I want green beans. All right, well, imagine they said, okay, so the waitress runs back, or waiter, and they run back, and they come back with your beer. All right, then they run back again, and they come back with your steak. Then they run back again, etc. That wouldn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. All right, but if it was done in a synchronous way, that's kind of the way that it would happen. All right, but with asynchronous, what you can do, and asynchronous typically means it's going to involve a call to an API and quite often a call to a database. It's going to take some time. So rather than when you make this call, rather than sitting around and waiting, you go on and do something else. And then when whatever it is you wanted to have happen finishes, it comes back and it lets you know. So you can call a function or do whatever. That's the callback. All right. Now I made it more simplistic than it is, but that's pretty much how all this stuff works. All right. So you can do it with a fetch API too. It says for new development, it's generally considered the best practice to use fetch and not XML HTTP request. Why? Well, just because it's typically easier for people to look at it and understand what's going on. Now, you'll notice it says in here for a GET, it returns a promise object. I believe we've talked about this before, but I want to quickly say it again, and that is with a promise is in one of three states. It's pending, all right, it's resolved, or it's rejected. All right? So imagine a new student comes in here. John Smith comes in, and he wants to sign up for the AWD 1100 C# class in spring. All right? So he comes in and he signs up, he does all the paperwork. Well, and then he said, they say, okay, how are you going to pay for this? And he says, I'll give you a check. So he gives you that check. He's not technically in the class yet, right? I mean, even if he's put on the roster, because if they try to cash the check and they go, there's no funds in here, they're not going to let the person in the class. So it's pending. But if they go and try to submit that to the bank and they're like, yep, no problem with that, all right, then it's resolved. If they do come back and say, nope, not enough money for that, the guy's got $5 in his account, it's going to be rejected. All right? So that's, I mean, just to let you see or let you know exactly what we're talking about here. So in here, when you do the fetch, you can see that the syntax is different. It's much more compact. It's much more concise. Now, what this says is we want to go out to right here and we want to find the users. If you can find them, then we want to have this response returned as JSON. All right? And we want to console log it. But if for some reason it fails, we just want an error message. So, I mean, imagine, not trying to sound too stupid here, but let's just say that you type this in, and you weren't paying attention when you were typing. So instead of users, you type Ubers in there. That's probably going to come back with that catch, and it's going to give you the error message. Does that make sense? All right. So it's looking for something like users or comments or posts, all the other stuff that we looked at previously. All right. And again, this is considered a much easier way of doing things, much more precise, concise, whatever you want to look at it. So with this astronomy picture of the day application, again, this is it. You put in a date. All right, so notice how they want it. It's year, month, day, I believe, and you click view, and it shows you a picture for that day. It does work. I've tried it before. All right, so as it says, it allows the user to enter a date and click the view button. As long as you put in a valid date, it displays an image or video for the specified date. I believe it has to be a past date. I don't think it takes dates in the future. I don't remember. I looked at it, but it's been a while. So they show you the CSS, and guess what? It isn't much. All right, there's not much in there. All right, and it says some of the CSS. All right, and this is the API that you have to go out to. All right, so they go out there and they make a request to that API. Now, in order to do that, as mentioned right here, you typically need a key. I think we've talked a little bit about this before, but I just want to quickly say it again. The reason for that is, if you're going to go out and make 1 million requests a day, all right, the key might be free, but they're not going to allow you to keep doing this. I found this cool site yesterday, and unfortunately I lost the URL already, but I found this cool site that actually had some books that were free that you could download as PDFs. I'm like, wow, there's like about 10 books I want there. So I put 5 in. I put in the 6th one, and it spun, and it spun, and it spun, and it spun. And I went back and looked at the message, and it said, you have reached your maximum quota of books for the day, which is 5. All right? If you want more, then they wanted me to sign up and pay. And it's the same kind of an idea here. Now, the good news is, for most APIs, and it varies, but for instance, we did one where we went out to the Open Movie Database API, all right? And you can have up to, I think it's 100,000 checks a day where you can go and visit that. And if it's more than that, they want to start charging you. Well, I mean, let's be real here. You're not going to go out there 100,000 times a day, all right? All right, and as it says, you need a date in year, dash, month, dash, day format, okay? All right. So the JavaScript for this I thought was a little bit complex right there. That's why I gave you a simpler example. All right, so I'm not going to go over this. We're going to go over the other example that I gave you, both of them, in just a couple minutes. And there's more JavaScript. All right. So it says making a single JavaScript or Ajax request as shown so far in this chapter allows you to add all sorts of nifty functionality to your websites. But if you need to make additional requests, it becomes more complicated. Well, it's what you'd expect. The more you ask for, the harder it's going to be. All right? So what they're showing in here is, notice, they've got a bunch of these. All right, so you've got this, and while you're waiting, etc., you're going to go down and try to do this. And then you're going to try to do this, etc. So it says if you need to use the data from an asynchronous call to make another asynchronous call, you nest one function within the other. That's what leads to this callback hell. All right? And you can get callback hell regardless. I mean, you can still get, it says how fetch solves callback hell. No. But it is technically still possible, depending on what you're doing, to have a callback hell in just about any one of these. All right. So it says instead of nesting callbacks, the example does what's called chaining. Notice they're all in there with dot thens. That's the chaining. All right. Now, one thing that you typically find that they don't show in here is at the bottom, you'd have a dot catch. Depending on how you do this, sometimes you also use a try block for all this stuff, and then your catch blocks, that's where you put the error handling. All right, it just depends on the way that it's being written. All right. So you can name your callback functions. All right, why would you want to do that? Well, it makes it a little bit more self-documenting to do that. So it says you can use named callback functions to make a promise chain easier to read, understand, and maintain. But again, until you've done some of this stuff, it's probably not going to make a whole boatload of sense. All right, error handling, we already started to get over this. There's the catch. All right, and what do you do with that? This catch is going to be called if any one of those three .then statements fail. So if the first one fails, you're not going to do the second and third. You're just immediately going to go down to the catch. So as it says, it's a good practice to end every promise chain with a catch method for general errors. And you can also include a catch method, all right, earlier in the promise chain for a specific error if you want to or need to. Plus, you can put in a finally. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about exception handling in JavaScript. The finally always runs. So either you're going to do the read file, the then is going to succeed, and you're going to do the finally, or you're going to do the read file, the then will fail, you'll do the catch, and you'll do the finally. And again, the finally is typically used for housekeeping, cleanup type of activities. Yeah, they even mention that there. Okay. So this photo viewer I'm not going to talk about. I just found it a very difficult example to comprehend. Take a look at it. Maybe you look at it and totally disagree with me. All right. So it says so far in this chapter, we've shown how to work with promise objects that use fetch, then, and catch. However, you can use promises outside of these methods too. So as it says, you can create and use your own promise objects. All right? And much code that's written today is written like this. So notice with this, we're returning a new promise. We already talked about this, that you don't put in the pending, because once this promise returns, it's either going to be resolved or it's going to be rejected. All right? So, again, you can use your own. All right. Static methods of the promise type. What that means is you don't have to create an object to use these. You can say promise dot if you need to. I'm not going to read these to you, but you can look at all of them. All right? Some would say that they're more like utility functions, but they allow you to work with this stuff in a more streamlined type of manner. All right? And the chapter we're just about finished, but as it says, the async and await keywords. All right? So we came in with writing synchronous code, and then we went to asynchronous code, and we had callbacks. People have determined that that was too difficult, so they created promises. People said that was too difficult, so they created async and await. All right? Typically with async, and you'll see this in a minute, that if you create some kind of a routine, you'll put async in there, and then anything that could take some time will have await by it. And you're going to see that in just a second. Again, I don't want to sit and read this to you. All right? The key thing is right here. This paragraph talks about how you use the async keyword, and then how you use await with it. So just looking at example here, right, this is the way that it's typically used. So we've got this right here. Notice we put async in here, and it's not necessary that everything that's inside of here then has the word await. It's just things that could potentially take some time. Most of the stuff that we end up doing in the AWD 1111 class when we use async and await, with the await, it's on database operations. So you're trying to read one or more records, you're trying to update one or more records, you're trying to delete one or more records, add one or more records, etc. So as it says, the async keyword declares an asynchronous function, that's what it's short for, and the await keyword tells us to wait until it has been resolved. When I say resolved, either resolved or rejected. All right. So as it says here, if you want to make multiple requests, all right, it says, and the sequence of the request doesn't matter, you can use the promise.all. What does that mean? It means if you want to do a whole bunch of things, but the order in which you do them and the order in which things return doesn't matter, that's what you'd use. All right. Sometimes it does matter, sometimes it doesn't. But when you've got a bunch of promises that are chained together, and you say, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to, just because you've got 5 or 6 things doesn't mean that it's going to return to the first one, then return the second, then return the third. It's all time dependent. So there might be 6 things and it might return the 5th one first. If that doesn't matter, you can use a special kind of for loop in here that is designed to work with asynchronous stuff. So there it is. All right, looks a little bit different. It's like, well, what the heck is this? This is telling us to go through our whole thing of promises. All right. And I'm not going to read to you, but you can take a look at it right there. All right, then they go back with this photo viewer thing, and they rewrite that again with async and await. So this is the last thing that's discussed in the chapter, how to make cross-origin requests. Now, when you look at this, this is also referred to as CORS. All right, C-O-R-S. That's what it stands for, okay? And as it says, so far in the examples in this chapter work because they make requests to an API that allows cross-origin requests. You may or may not always want to do that. Let's think about when, maybe you wouldn't. So as an example, let's say that somebody can get into Walmart's website. Well, probably somebody who's a distributor to Walmart, let's say General Mills, the food company with cereals, they can probably go in and look at things on the website that you and I cannot. All right, because they're a distributor. All right, so they have the ability to do that. We don't. All right, not a great example, but it's, it says, many APIs don't allow cross-origin requests. As a result, you'll get an error if you try to make one. So, it says for security, browsers enforce a same origin policy for client-side code. In other words, it imagines everything is coming through the same source. And if you're constantly banging and you're going and you're here and it's no, go out to here, no, go out to here, and if it's a different website, it may not be allowed. It's what they're saying. All right. So it says browsers use cross-origin resource sharing to check whether JavaScript is allowed to do that and go across, all right, different domains. All right. So it says if you make an Ajax request to an API that doesn't allow CORS, your request will fail with an error message like the one that's shown in the figure here, something like that. It just doesn't allow it. So how do you get around that? It depends on what you're working with, but just to show you real quick that if this was an issue and we were working on something like, I don't know, like if we were working with Node.js, all right? So if I typed in here, npmjs.com, we're going to look at this tomorrow, but if I come in here and type in CORS, all right, there's CORS middleware. And if I bring that up and I install that, that basically says allow us to do cross-origin resource sharing. All right? if indeed that becomes an issue. All right, there are ways of getting around this. All right, iframes is pretty old. JSON-P is JSON with padding. All right, but the recommendation is that you use one of these. Now notice either a third party says only recommended for prototyping and testing, or you create your own. All right? So you might have work that you have to do on your own side to get this to work, is basically what they're saying. All right? Most of the important text is right here on the bottom of 651 if you want to take a look. And that's it. So let's take a look. So you've got the code, so I'm going to bring up both of these. Let me tell you, first of all, that the two HTML files are identical to one another. The only thing that's different between them, in fact, let me bring this up. I'll bring it up in code. The only difference between them is, oh, I thought I changed it. Maybe the one you has got is changed. Maybe it's not. But the title up here, oh, there it is. I put in the H1. The one says number facts fetch, and the other one says number facts XHR. But it's the same thing. All right. Also, I didn't give you the CSS. Why? That's why. That's the CSS. This just says when it first starts up, the thing that's going to show the information about the number fact, don't make it visible. That's it. So what I want to do is just spend a couple minutes here and go over under JS the xhr.js and the fetch.js. I believe I put the XHR one first on yours. I could be wrong, but I think that's the one. So again, you'll notice in here that the whole thing is a whopping 24 lines. All right? So what did we do here? Well, I came in and did that. I didn't put really hardly any comments, but you know what this is by now. You know that that is allowing us to go in and use an alias. So I don't have to constantly be saying document.getElementById. All right? So this will be the fact, and that'll be the fact text. All right? Where did it get that stuff from? Well, again, you've got to go back to here, and if we look at XHR HTML, okay, the div itself is called fact, and the paragraph that's inside of it is called fact text. That make sense? And again, we already saw this, but fact, so the div is invisible when you first start. All right? So we come in here, and this is the reason I showed you this is it goes through all the stuff we need to talk about. All right? So what we're doing in here in this number input, we're adding an event listener, and we're adding it to that right there, that's adding it to that text box itself where we're putting in the number. Because each time we're putting in a number, we want it to call getFact Ajax. That makes sense. All right? So we are setting up an event listener right there. And what does that event listener do? It's right here. All right? So we want to grab whatever number we put in, as long as it's not empty, and this was set up as a number field, so we can't put non-numeric text in there. So since it's a number field, the only thing that can be in there is either a number or blank. If it's blank, we're telling it to do nothing. All right? And all of that stuff should have been tabbed over. I'm not sure why it wasn't, but there. All right. So we make our request. We're telling it to do a get. So we want to go out to this website, which is numbersapi.com. So if you take a look right here on the screen, that's the website. So we are telling it to go out there, and we're giving it a number. All right, so random date, random math. All right. We're basically doing this. Does that make sense? All right, so we tell it to do this. We say if the status, and I don't know why, but that should have really been a triple equals, but that's fine. If it's equal to 200, then we want to show it. All right? and we only want to show it if it worked. Now, you may or may not have noticed this, but if I go back here, let me go back and run it. So again, the interface on the two of these is exactly the same. And I've got this blown way up. So let's see. There it is at 100%, but I want to make sure you can all see it. So I'll leave it about there, okay? And if I come in here and I put in a 1, so notice I'm trying to put in non-numeric stuff, and it's not taking it. All right? It will take a negative sign, unfortunately. But if I put in -1, it says it's something we're missing a fact for. All right? So if I come in here and just put in a 1, it's gone out there, and it's found in there. That's the JSON that's associated with 1. That should make sense. If I add another 1, all right, then you can see it. And if I add another 1, you can see it. But eventually, it's going to do this. It's going to either say that it's uninteresting, or it's a number for which they're missing a fact, or it's unremarkable, all right, etc. So you get the idea, all right? And then if we look at the other one, again, other than it now says number facts fetch, it's the same one as the one we showed before. So let's look at the fetch, rather. You'll notice that's 16 lines. And if I would have left that out, it would have been 15 lines. All right? So we're just like we did before. We are setting up an event listener, exactly like we did before. All right? We are, again, saying number is whatever we've inputted in there. And again, just like we did, if the number is not empty, all right, then we're doing fetch. Now, what are we doing here? What is this doing? I'm building a URL right there, because I'm telling it to go out to numbersapi.com and then put in there the number on the end. All right? And again, we're telling it that, okay, that's going to be the response, and we want to take the data. We want to display it as block because, remember, it was display none, and we want the inner text to equal that data. If it doesn't work, we want some kind of an error. That really shouldn't happen because, again, the only things that we should be able to put in here is nothing, all right, or a number. All right, even a negative number, we're just going to get some kind of an error message, not an error message, but some kind of a message that says there's nothing for this number, etc. So ideally, you can look at that and you can see that this is doing it using the fetch. So we're not going in and checking for 200 status. We're not checking for a 404, etc. It's all being handled in that catch statement. All right? As opposed to the other way. So what is that? It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 or 8 lines of code. And if we do it with the XHR, you can see it's not a big difference, but it's at least somewhat of a difference. All right, and that was the idea. That's what I wanted to show you. All right, and truth be told, because I believe in disclosure, that if I come out here and I go to YouTube and I type in Brad Traversy, I think it was number, found it. There it is. Vanilla.js, number facts, app, Ajax, and fetch. So if you're interested, and I gave you the code, mine's a little bit different than his, but not too much. Okay, questions? So tomorrow, again, will be the last lecture. We're going to go over Node.js. We're not going to do that much with it. I just want to show you a few things about it in particular. Probably talk for a few minutes about Node, talk for a few minutes about the Node package manager in NPM, talk for a few minutes about Express. And we'll go over the chapter. All right, then that'll be it. Like I said, Friday will be lab the entire day. Monday next week, I will show you how to install the Visual Studio, I should say, not Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio that we'll use next semester. Tuesday, we'll install at least Android Studio. All right, then that's all I had.